My, how you've grown since I was last here. Come on in. We're going to get started. Our next session is Break Glass in Case of Emergency, How to Recession-Proof Your Startup, which would explain how the audience has grown. Building off our last session, we're talking about how to recession-proof your startup. I'm sure a lot of founders in the audience are thinking about this. As capital markets crash and supply chains continue to struggle, founders must change with the times. In this session, we're going to hear best practices for weathering the storm, including new metrics that matter for fundraising, and how founders can control their destiny by controlling their burn. Please give a very warm welcome to Sequoia Capital partner Andrew Reed and Vanta CEO Christine Cacioppo. Thank you.
Christina Cacioppo.
Cacioppo.
Nice to see you here.
Nice to see you.
In scenic Toronto. Hey, everybody. So by way of background, my name's Andrew Reed. I'm a partner at Sequoia Capital. Sequoia is a Bay Area-based but global venture capital firm. Been around for 50 years. We're known for past investments in companies like Apple, Google, Oracle, Cisco, LinkedIn, PayPal, Stripe, Airbnb, Zoom, many others. And about a year and a half ago, we came across a small but plucky startup called Vanta, who we originally identified actually because they had an extremely fast-growing penetration into Sequoia's portfolio. A bunch of our companies were Vanta customers, and they were flagging the product towards us as pretty exceptional. And we got in touch with Christina, and were lucky enough to lead the Series A. And about a year and a half later, a lot's changed in the world. Vanta's substantially larger now than it was then, but everyone seems to want to talk about the macro environment and inflation and monetary policy and tech stocks and what that might mean for the private company startup fundraising environment. Now, you can take my word for it, or you can take Christina's word, because Christina is the rare founder that raised a $110 million Series B into the teeth of this market in April 2022. She had a tweet that said, "Nothing makes a growth stage founder feel alive like going fundraising in April 2022. So Christina, from the founder perspective, how has the fundraising environment changed?
Yeah, so it's quite different. As Andrew alluded, we raised our first round of really venture money in February 2021, right? And so that was coming out of COVID. Everyone was still at home on Zoom, maybe a little bored, wanted to make new friends, wanted to make investments, very excited about growth. And so like the primary questions we got then were like, how are you growing so how quickly are you growing? How are you growing so quickly? And why haven't you hired more salespeople to like grow even faster, right? Flash forward a year and a half, and April of 2022, like the game on the field had just totally changed. Where it was much more about like, okay, you're growing, great, but like, what is the cost of that? This metric of burn multiple, which basically just measures for every like dollar of revenue, how much did that cost you to get, or how much did you burn to get that? What is your margin profile? What is your retention? What is your CAC? Like, you need to be growing, but also you need to be doing it in a sustainable way. And so much more scrutiny on those metrics. That was like one big difference. And then the other one, and I mean this is true of Sequoia and a great number of funds, the funds that are able to invest in the public markets and the private markets, their cost of capital for private just kind of went up substantially given how much the public markets are down. And so it wasn't, like, oh, let's compare Vanta to like another private company that might be growing at some rate. But it was also compared to like Zoom, which is off, I don't know, some double-digit percentage of its peak, and is arguably like really, really cheap right now. And so it was just a totally different funding environment. Oops.
And maybe before we talk about, I'll give you a second to get your microphone back in. Yeah, and yet.
Oh, thank you. Okay, great.
So before we talk about kind of the how and why you guys were able to successfully raise a very nice round in this market, why don't you give the audience a little bit of a explainer on what Vanta is, the problem that it solves, and how it all works?
Yeah, so we started Vanta a couple years ago with the idea that we wanted to help other software companies both shore up their security, get more secure, and then prove that security, often through compliance certifications like SOC 2, ISO 27001, GDPR, that sort of thing. So really what we do is we just work with software companies, often the fastest growing amongst them, and for the kind of small and mighty and ambitious, help them get their security in a good spot, and then prove that to their customers so they can ultimately grow their business.
Yeah, so this is a problem that I actually had noticed before we got involved with Vanta, which is there's a board meeting that every startup seems to have, which is you've had 3 successive board meetings talking about the product roadmap and all the stuff you want to build and the pipeline that's building. And then there's the oh crap board meeting where it's we have this deal at the 1 yard line, but we need our compliance, our ISO, our SOC 2, et cetera, and we can't get the deal done until we get that. And it used to be 9 months and lots of engineers and manual process to get that done, and that was often wedged before all the fun stuff on the roadmap and the pipeline closing.
Yep.
And then once Vanta got involved, a bunch of companies I work with, it turned from 9 months to 3 months, and instead of lots of engineers, it was a half an engineer and a lot more automation. So I can speak to the problem statement very clearly, and obviously the solution has kind of begun to speak for itself. Why don't you talk a little bit about when kind of some of the primary motivations for your customers in terms of like when they get on the phone with you, what are the specific things that they're looking to solve?
Yeah, so especially in the first couple years, it was like very compliance focused. So as Andrew mentioned, often our earliest customers were founders. They were trying to take their product to market, and it started to go well, and like people were starting to say yes, and then they'd sell to like bigger and bigger companies, and by bigger I mean 200, 300 person companies, like not behemoths, but like, moderately sized. And they'd like have their champion, and the champion would say yes, and we really want to buy. And then it would be like, oh, but you have to go through security review. And by the way, the first step in security review is fill out this spreadsheet of 9 quadrillion questions, or go get a SOC 2, or like, here I'm throwing more letters at you, but like, we like your product, but we won't buy until you prove to us that you're reasonably secure, that you're not just some lurky startup that's going to like take all of our customer data and leak it on the internet, right? And so in kind of classic founder lore and reality, a lot of these founders were like, what is SOC 2, right? And you Google that, you ask your investor, and if you go back to like 2017, before Vanta, it was a lot of like, I'm on some accounting firm's website, and they, are trying to talk technical, but it's not totally ringing true, or the investor would say, do you really need to do this now? Can we do it later? Anyway. And what we did with Vanta was sort of figure out how to turn SOC 2 and these regulations kind of into code, right? So it was like, here, founder, here's a list of things. You just need to burn through them. And when you do all the things, we'll help you work with an auditor, one of those accountants, and get you through. And that clarity, I think in that like saving time, but really just taking this nebulous, like, what is a SOC 2, who even knows tribal knowledge thing, and turning it into like, oh, no, here's just a list of stuff to go do, like really unlocked a lot of this. And so now, I mean, it's funny, like now we have 2-person startups that come to Vanta and use us to get secure and compliant. And that was always the goal, but in 2018, raising the seed round, I walked around and told all the VCs that, hey, I'm going to go, get all your startups compliant, and they'd look back at me and say, none of our startups need compliance. What are you talking about? But it just changed so much, because now it's easier to do, so now more startups do it, so your competitors do it, and it's just like kind of become part of the fabric of almost early stage B2B software.
Totally. Now, one thing I remember, if you presume the funding environment is changing or will change or has changed, I remember back when we first met and you popped up. I remember you look on Crunchbase and you guys had raised a small amount of seed money.
3.2.
Yeah, and it had dozens of employees, and you popped up the spreadsheet that said, if you just passed 10 million ARR, so what do you think? And that was, getting to 10 million ARR on basically rounds to zero money was, I thought, pretty unique and impressive.
Yep.
And I presume that's going to be something that a lot of founders in the audience will be curious to hear, some of the tips and tricks on how you manage to scale that far with so little capital.
Yeah, so like one kind of macro thought, and then some like super tactical tips. the macro thought is, so I was really fortunate. After undergrad, I started my career at a venture capital firm, an early stage firm in New York called Union Square Ventures. And it was great and learned a lot. And one of the primary things I learned was that investors really like to fund companies that don't need to get funded. And if you need funding, they're much less interested in funding you, right? And like, we can debate how reasonable that is, but it just kind of seemed to be like a truth of startup VC. And so, and I think I like deeply kind of, imbibed that. And so part of this was, okay, well, how can Vanta sort of not need money? Because then it'll be really easy to get money. And that was kind of the macro plan that, again, sort of worked, I think, coupled with like the 2021 funding environment. Anyway, so that was some of where it came from. But in terms of tips, so one part of it, I wouldn't totally recommend replicating this, but we were just terrible at hiring. Like, we were hiring as fast as we could, which was terribly slowly. And I think some of it because we were like kind of under the radar, like no one knew about us. We were this plucky seed stage startup. And so we just learned to like work with very few people, especially relative to other companies. And it was kind of persisted so long, everyone thought it was normal. So there was some of that of just, you probably want to be much better at hiring than we were, but being so terrible at hiring sort of taught us to like, everyone wore 14 hats, and that was just a Vanta thing. Another part that is more replicable, and I would totally recommend, was we, for the first couple of years, almost exclusively charged our customers annually up front. And so what was basically was like, they'd sign a Vanta contract, they'd send us, the 5-figure fee, and we would get that on kind of day 0. And what that let us do was basically work at cash flow break even all the way through. So we had, the $3 million in the bank that we mostly didn't touch, but it was just because of the cash flow dynamics. And I think this was something that I'd read a blog post. Peter Reinhardt from Segment had this good blog post on cash flow, and I remember reading it like in 2015 and being like, this seems very smart. And there's a good graph, and like I didn't quite understand it, but was like, oh, there's probably something here. And then just seeing it at Vanta and seeing how we were able to do so much without kind of touching the bank account was like super striking. So that is the closest thing I have to a cheat code that I would entirely recommend.
Yeah, another thing I would just add is you said that investors don't like funding companies that need funding. The thing I would just maybe like tweak on that slightly is I think there's a general tendency for startups to try to act bigger than they are, seem bigger than they are, and oftentimes from the investor lens, when you get the numbers, it's like, okay, well, this is just a company, and I still have this visceral memory of just the bar chart that you showed, and just like, wow, I knew it was working, but I didn't realize it was working like this. And I think just in terms of being a little more under the radar and more substance than style, like I think obviously it's very but also I think it tends to be like a hallmark of a lot of great companies.
So that was also kind of purposeful, and some of it was driven by paranoia, honestly, because Vanta started to work early, where you were like, we are just selling faster and better than we have any rights to, right? Like, my joke, but it's true. Like, the last thing I sold prior to Vanta was Girl Scout cookies. And then I sold a lot of Vantas, and you're like, this is not because of skill. Like, there's something else here. But the paranoia part was, this is actually a really good idea, and we don't want anyone else to realize that. We just want to run for a bit. And so some of the under-radarness was just like, how long can we run? How far out can we get? Because this actually seems like it's working.
Yep. And then obviously we invested, and your broken hiring process through the amazing Vanta recruiting team got revved up quite a bit. So you've gone from dozens of employees to hundreds of employees. Along that journey, obviously it's super steep growth, and even in markets like this, the job of startups is to grow as big as possible, subject to various constraints. What are some of the lessons learned in the growth phase that you would share with founders in the audience?
For sure. And Andrew can, just for folks in the audience, Andrew can speak very cogently and with credibility about our hiring process, because I think he still talks to like a solid double-digit percentage of Vanta candidates. Like, Andrew is very involved in our recruiting, and it's wonderful. But that said, we did go from about 50, 60 people at the Series A to about 250 today. And it's hard, right? Like, there's a lot of, it's great but it's hard. And the phrase we actually use internally is like the winning and drowning combo, where you can be like winning and it can be going well, and also you can feel like you're drowning because stuff is just coming, at you left, right, and center. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of process, there's a lot of customers, like whatever. There's just so much going on, where at any given moment you can be like, oh my gosh, everything is on fire. Why is nothing working? And then if you like zoom out a bit, you're like, ooh, still growing at like 12% a month compounded, like this is good. And some of it was just narrating over that and normalizing it because everyone was feeling it. And it's this weird feeling because also in the winning drowning, you like feel like you should feel great because you're winning, but again, you're like up to your eyes in muck. So that, like talking about that, like having, a phrase for it, normalizing it has been really helpful across the board. What else? I mean, onboarding, starting to spend more and more time on, because you can go, if you have a great recruiting team, which you do, and you go, bring in 100 people, and if they don't really know what to do or don't feel set up to do their best work, like, well, that's really not helpful to anyone at all. And so things like forcing 30, 60, 90s up front, like actually before you start hiring someone, so that internally kind of what you want the person to do. You share that with people during the interview process so they know truly what they're signing up for. That's been really helpful because I think prior Vanta, and I mean, it started with like founder recruiting, everything messed up a lot on expectations, where you like have someone really promising and you have, a million problems. So you're like, oh, just come in and we've so many problems and it'll be great. And then the role ends up being not quite the magical unicorn role you described. So working through that has been really important too. Operations team, go-to-market ops team. I did not understand the importance of that early enough, but yeah, if I could like go back a year, it'd be like, oh, go do that earlier.
Yeah. And then, so we're 250 people now. I think, I will not make you do macro prognostications.
That's all you.
But heading into turbulent waters, what are some of the things that you have done or are doing to prepare Vanta to succeed in the new market climate?
Yeah, so there's a lot of kind of we got to the Series A, which for us was $10 million in revenue on the 3.2 million seed round. There's a lot of this that was baked in early, which is great. Like we didn't have kind of fancy coffee in the office to some folks' chagrin, but and I think some of that was important kind of for the cost, although like, you're not going to spend that much, but actually just much more for the cultural signal. So some of the stuff now is kind of that return to roots and being like, hey, we want folks to enjoy working at Vanta because they're doing great, meaningful work and they feel like they're growing in their careers. They might not get the nicest coffee of any startup ever, right? But kind of being very clear about sort of our value prop to Vantans, folks who work at Vanta. There's, stuff around. There's a lot. I think for a B2B startup, you're both trying to, like, to my point about annual upfront payments, trying to like do things like that help Vanta while also being empathetic to your customers who might be going, feeling the turbulence themselves. And so just a lot of frameworks to try to help, especially the customer success team, navigate conversations like that, right? Like if I could wave a magic wand, would love if everyone, continued to pay Vanta annually up front, but also don't want to, turn away customers so we can truly help them grow their businesses, because we like take such a hard line on that. So just kind of being clear on those sort of frameworks. So again, with a larger team, folks can navigate those conversations with their customers. That's another really big piece for us.
And then one of the things that I've always really admired about Vanta is there's sort of this double bottom line impact on the startup community, right? Where first thing that Vanta does, obviously, is it just increases the aggregate level of security amongst startups generally, right? Because startups are getting their SOC 2 earlier, they're being more careful with data earlier, and as a result, I think that's a good thing for the startup ecosystem generally. And in doing so, Vanta also, I think, unblocks economic opportunity for a lot of startups where, previously it's not a big deal for the incumbent companies to waive all sorts of paperwork at startups around security and say, we can win this deal over you because of X, Y, and Z. And I think Vanta has done a really nice job of leveling that particular playing field and letting startups compete and win on the merits of their products and their value propositions, and kind of take care of some of the behind-the-scenes security stuff automatically. But why don't we talk a little about kind of the Vanta leveling the playing field for startups, right? Like, in this market environment, how can Vanta help startups win?
Yeah, so this is something that's really important to us, and honestly, some of the founding impetus is we wanted to build a company that helped other startups succeed, and honestly, helped more great software get out into the hands of people. Right, and that's very broad, and there's a lot of ways to do it, but one of the things we saw and kind of experienced in prior lives and jobs and with friends was, you have the plucky startup that built a brand new tool, and they're trying to, get adoption, and then you have the incumbent that kind of seems like it was designed in 1996 and makes everyone sad when they use. And when those two meet in a procurement process, the incumbent would win because it has every security compliance certification under the sun, like a veritable alphabet soup. Anyway, and so the idea with Vanta was truly, can we help these early companies get those, and get those truly, not just rubber stamp, oh, everything's fine, no one cares, move on, but truly improve their security and then truly prove the security they have, and so that they can compete for this new business. And I think particularly in the upcoming environment of potential recession and worries about doom and gloom, I think we are going to see sort of a flight to, upmarket, enterprise, mid-market, right? There's a lot of VC Twitter that's you shouldn't sell to startups anymore because they're all going to go under. Go sell to the big companies, and whether or not all the startups are going to go under, one thing that Vanta does is helps open up those new markets for startups, right? Helps remove barriers to selling to the big companies so that the best products can shine and win in the marketplace, and again, don't get stymied by what historically has felt like a bunch of red tape and kind of not super productive work. So I think especially in this environment, there's this strong piece of, Vanta can help, not just the startup get more revenue because they can sell to new customers, but it's new revenue from enterprise, from mid-market, from these parts of the market that were A, probably previously inaccessible, and B, much more resistant to any sort of economic downturn if one is to come.
And you're, a rare founder who's been on both sides of the fundraising table. Obviously, the first one was an eternity ago in startup years. No offense. And you publicly say you don't like fundraising. You're also proven to be pretty darn good at it. Are there any, just beyond building a really great business, any tactics, advice, strategy that you would share in terms of what it takes to be successful fundraising through market cycles?
I mean, I think it's mostly have a good business, which, you're step one, get a time machine, step two, go back 2 years, build good business, but that's not super helpful. But there are things, of going out and being able to say, hey, whether or not you fund me, Mr. or Mrs. Venture capitalists, we have runway, right? This isn't existential for us. We can operate the business in a way that, burns very little cash or gets to where we are, with customer payments or whatever it is. Going back to the, it's better not to need the money is the best way to get the money point. So there's a bunch of things around that. And then probably the, easiest to implement trick, and this is totally a trick that surprisingly works. I remember this at USV, was everyone talks about how you want to get a warm intro to a VC, and great, do that, but actually get, no joke, 5 warm intros to the VC, because it was just funny. You would see one intro come in, and the partner would be like, cool, yeah, I trust this person, I'll take the meeting. And then you have 2 or 3 more people ping the partner, and then they're like, whoa, wait, people really like this company. And then if you, get the 4th or 5th person to ping the partner, they're just this must be the next, Google, what's going on? Gotta meet this company. And it's very silly, but it seems to work surprisingly well. Do people do that to you?
I mean, besides you?
Yeah, I did.
So I think 2 things are quite obvious. Number one, building a great business requires building revenue, buying Vanta gets your business capable of generating more revenue faster with less cost against it. So I'd say for all the startups in the audience, if you haven't spoken to Vanta, I would encourage you to do so. And then from the investor side, like, I think you're going to hear a lot this week, the next couple of months on VC Twitter or wherever else about, you know, the ups and downs of the economy. But the reality is like we've never been market investors, right? There is a market of startups, but you know, the dispersion in outcomes is so broad that we've never really looked at like aggregate multiples or anything else. And if you have built a great business, like we are very much still investing and still investing large amounts of money. So I encourage everyone to reach out to Sequoia too. So
yeah, no, very true. I mean, and you look at, you know, it's better than I do, but if you like look at the venture returns over the past 2 decades, right? There's great companies that get funded in downturns left, right, and center. The like Google, PayPal, Salesforce, right? There's this whole, you know, set of them that's very true. And I think in some ways, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if almost like quote unquote better businesses get funded in the downturn because everything is just harder. And so if you're kind of like able to persist and survive, there's actually a lot of like grit and determination in that. Because yeah, it's not like you can kind of walk out the door and fundraise and get tens of millions of dollars like it kind of felt like at points last year.
Yeah, well said. All right, I think with that, I think we're at time.
Great.
Thank you all.
Thank y'all.